The text came through at 4:47 on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I was standing at my sister Margaret's kitchen sink in Vermont, drying a coffee cup with a red-checkered dish towel, when my phone buzzed once against the butcher block beside me. I set the cup down carefully. I set the towel down. I wiped my hands on the front of my cardigan, a slow, deliberate gesture I didn't know I was making until I realized I was stalling. A woman knows when a phone call is going to change her life. But a text is a new kind of violence. It comes quietly. It doesn't ring. It doesn't give you warning. It just sits there on the screen, black letters on white, waiting for you to read what someone decided was easier to write than to say. The message was from my daughter-in-law, Brooke. It was 4 sentences long. I read them 3 times before I understood that the life I had been living for the last 18 months was over. This is no longer your home, the last sentence read. Brooke. I set the phone face down on the counter. I looked out the kitchen window at the maple tree in my sister's backyard, leaves gone to copper and rust, and I heard myself laugh. A small dry laugh. Because Brooke, who thought she had just delivered the most devastating news of my life, did not know the first thing about my life. She did not know what my husband and I had done in the last year before he died. She did not know whose name was on the deed to the house she believed she had just taken. And she most certainly did not know that by dawn, her life would be the one that had changed. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. Margaret was standing at the kitchen table slicing her apple pie, the one she had been making every October of our lives since 1968. She looked up when she heard me laugh, and her expression changed the way only a sister's can. Evelyn, she said. What is it? I picked up the phone. I read the text out loud. All 4 sentences. When I finished, Margaret set down the pie knife very slowly, the way you set down a weapon when you realize the fight has moved to another room. That little, she started, and then she stopped herself, because Margaret had been a second-grade teacher for 36 years and she had trained herself out of certain words. She looked at me and she said, Ev, what are you going to do? I stood there a moment longer. I looked at the maple tree. I looked at the pie still steaming faintly on the cooling rack. I looked at my sister's kind, worried face, and I realized that I had been preparing for this afternoon for 18 months without admitting it to myself. I'm going to make 1 phone call, I said. And then I'm going to drive home tonight. Margaret glanced at the window. It was already going dark. Vermont dark, the early kind that swallows the mountains. Ev, it's a 6-hour drive. In the rain. Let me come with you. I smiled at her. It was the first real smile I had smiled that day. No, sweetheart. I need you to stay here. I need someone to tell the truth from outside the house, if it comes to that. I picked up the phone and walked out of the kitchen, down the hall to the guest room my sister had made up for me with the quilt our mother had sewn in 1962. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not dialed in almost a year. Harold Whitmore, attorney at law. Harold had been my husband's law partner for 31 years. He had been a guest at our wedding. He had carried Richard's casket. He had also helped me, in the last 6 months of Richard's life, draft a set of documents that no one in my family knew existed. I pressed his number. He answered on the second ring. Evelyn, he said, and I could hear the surprise, the instant alertness, the long friendship in that one word. Is everything all right? Harold, I said, I need you to activate the Hartwell provision tonight. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Calculation. All of it, he asked. All of it, I said. By sunrise. He exhaled. I could hear him sit down at his desk. I heard the sound of him opening a file drawer. Tell me what happened, he said. So I did. I told Harold about the text. I told him I was driving home that night. And I asked him to meet me at the house at 7 o'clock in the morning with the full set of documents and with him. My husband's old firm had a way of getting things done when the Hartwells called. He said, I'll be there at 6:30. I hung up. I sat on the bed for a long moment with my hands in my lap. And I thought, not with rage but with a quiet, clear certainty I had not felt since the day Richard died. My daughter-in-law had no idea who she had just texted. Let me tell you who I am because Brooke certainly never bothered to ask. My name is Evelyn Hartwell. I am 71 years old. For 43 years I was a real estate and estate planning attorney at Hartwell and Whitmore, the firm my husband Richard founded with Harold in 1978, the year I finished law school. Richard was senior partner. I was, for most of those years, the quiet second-chair strategist who handled the complicated trusts, the multi-generational estates, the family disputes that required someone with a long memory and a very steady hand. The Philadelphia magazines never put my picture on the cover. I was not that kind of lawyer. I was the kind of lawyer you hired when the kind of lawyer who was on the magazine cover had already failed you, and you needed someone to go back through 50 years of paperwork and find the clause that saved your family farm. I did that work for 43 years. Richard and I built the house in Chestnut Hill the year our son Marcus was born, 1981. We watched Marcus grow up in that house. We planted the dogwoods along the side yard. I put in the roses myself, every single one of them, over the course of 2 summers in the early 90s. Richard designed the library off the back of the house with his own hands, drafting every shelf and every built-in on graph paper at the kitchen table. When Marcus was 12, I finished the garden wall behind the kitchen with stones we carried in from the creek at the edge of our property. I tell you this because I need you to understand. That house was not a house. That house was the 43-year-long record of a marriage. Richard died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of the year before last. He was sick for 9 months. Marcus visited 4 times. Brooke visited twice, both of those times to tell me what she had decided about Richard's care. In the last week of his life, when Richard could no longer speak above a whisper, he turned to me one afternoon and said very quietly, "Ev, make sure the boy is all right." I said, "Marcus." He closed his eyes. He said, "No. The other boy. Noah. Make sure Noah is all right." Then he went to sleep and 24 hours later he was gone. The other boy was my grandson. Noah was 12 years old then. He is 12 years old still, or he was 12 when this story began. Noah is my son's child from his first marriage, to a beautiful serious woman named Catherine, who died in a highway accident when Noah was 4. Marcus remarried 18 months later, which struck me as very fast, but Marcus has always done things on a schedule that made sense only to Marcus. The woman he married was Brooke. Brooke was 31 when they met, a former management consultant who had been quietly laid off, and was looking for what she would later call a strategic pivot. She married Marcus in a very expensive wedding at a hotel I had never heard of in Delaware, and she acquired Noah the way some women acquire a vintage handbag, as a piece of the deal she had not asked for and would have preferred not to carry. I watched this for 7 years. I watched the way Brooke spoke to Noah when she thought no one was listening. I watched the way Marcus found reasons to be on his phone during the moments when his wife was cruel to his son. I watched Noah grow quieter and smaller and more careful, and I watched my grandson, who had my husband's exact eyes, learn to disappear in a room. Richard saw all of this too. Richard, who had been the fiercest, most unshakable man I had ever known, watched his only grandson learn to flinch at the sound of his stepmother's footsteps, and he made me a promise on the porch of our house on the evening before his first chemotherapy appointment. He said, "Evelyn, I don't know what is going to happen to me, but I need you to promise me that whatever we have, whatever we've built, it gets to Noah. Not Marcus. Noah." I said, "Richard, are you sure?" He said, "Marcus has made his choices and he will continue to make them. He will not protect that boy. I need you to be the one who does." I said, "I promise." And in the last 6 months of his life, between the chemotherapy appointments and the hospital stays and the quiet dinners we ate at the kitchen table when he could still eat, Richard and I and Harold Whitmore sat in the library he had designed with his own hands, and we restructured our entire estate. We built what Harold called the Hartwell provision. It had 3 parts. The house was placed in a revocable trust in my name alone, with Noah as the sole contingent beneficiary upon my death. The firm's holding company, which had quietly acquired a small portfolio of commercial real estate in downtown Philadelphia over the course of 30 years, was restructured so that my sole voting share controlled everything. And finally, a trust was established in Noah's name, funded from a life insurance policy we had maintained on Richard for the entirety of our marriage. Noah was now, whether he knew it or not, a very quietly wealthy 12-year-old boy. Marcus did not know about any of this. Brooke certainly did not know. Richard and I had agreed that they did not need to. Richard, who had loved his son, had come to understand something about him in the last year of his life. He had come to understand that Marcus was not a bad man, but that he was a weak one, and that weakness, when married to a woman like Brooke, produced the kind of moral arithmetic that ended with a cold text sent to a 71-year-old widow visiting her sister in Vermont. Richard knew this before he died. Richard knew this, and he gave me the tools to do what needed to be done when it happened. And as I sat on my sister's guest bed that Thursday evening in October, I understood, finally, what he had been trying to prepare me for. Marcus and Brooke had moved into my house 6 months after Richard's funeral. They did not ask. They announced. Marcus called me one Saturday morning and said, "Mom, Brooke and I have been talking, and we don't think you should be alone in that big house." I was, at that moment, standing in the rose garden, deadheading the last of the fall blooms. I said, "Marcus, I've been alone in this house for 4 months and I'm perfectly fine." He said, "Mom, you're not fine. You're 70. You're going to fall, or you're going to leave the stove on, or something is going to happen, and we're not going to know for days. Brooke and I have talked about it. We're going to move in for a while to help you adjust. We'll rent out our place in Bryn Mawr. It just makes sense." I remember standing there among the roses, the shears still in my hand, and feeling a particular kind of quiet settle in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to recognition. I had been a lawyer for 43 years. I knew the sound of a negotiation that had already been concluded by one side. I said, "Marcus, I'll think about it." He said, "Mom, there's really nothing to think about. Brooke has already given notice to our tenants." Brooke had already given notice to their tenants. I did not have the conversation I wanted to have on the phone that morning. I learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a lawyer can do in a negotiation is listen. So I listened. I said, "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." And I hung up the phone and went back to my roses, and I thought for a long time about what had just happened. What had just happened was that my son had decided, without consulting me, that I had become a liability. And his wife, who had been waiting for this moment since the first time she had set foot in my house, had seen an opening. They moved in 6 weeks later. They brought a moving truck and 3 men and enough furniture to fill the 4-bedroom house a second time. Brooke brought a box of decorative throw pillows that cost more than my first car. She brought art. She brought candles that smelled like a department store. She brought Noah, who arrived at the front door with a small suitcase and an expression I had seen on the faces of children at custody hearings, the expression of a child who has learned not to get attached to where he sleeps. I hugged my grandson at the door. I said, "You are going to love it here, sweetheart. Your grandfather built this house. I'm going to show you everything." Brooke, standing behind him, said, "He'll need to wipe his shoes before he comes in. I've just had the carpets cleaned." Her carpets. In my house. 6 weeks after she had moved in. The takeover did not happen all at once. That is not how takeovers work. Takeovers happen the way erosion happens. You look up one day and the shoreline has moved. The first thing to go was the library. Richard's library, the room he had designed with his own hands, the room where we had drafted the Hartwell provision, the room where I had sat with him on the last Sunday morning he was able to leave our bedroom. Brooke informed me about 3 weeks after they moved in, that she and Marcus needed a home office, and that the library was really the only room in the house that made sense. "We'll box up Richard's books very carefully," she said, in the tone one uses to reassure a child that a procedure will not hurt. "We'll put them in the attic. You'll know exactly where they are." I watched them box up my husband's library over the course of a Saturday. I watched them take down the small framed law school diploma he had kept on the wall above his desk. I watched Marcus, my own son, place his father's reading glasses in a cardboard box marked "Attic, Dad," and seal it with packing tape. And I did not say a word. Because I had made a decision, sitting on the bench in my rose garden the night before, that I was not going to fight this at the level they were fighting it. I was going to watch. I was going to wait. And I was going to remember. Brooke redecorated the library in a style she called modern farmhouse. It looked like a magazine photograph of a room no one had ever lived in. She took Richard's desk, the heavy oak desk his own father had given him on the day he passed the bar, and she had it carried out to the garage, where it sat, covered in a tarp, for the next 15 months. She replaced it with a white piece of furniture from a Swedish retailer that arrived in a flat box. The next thing to go was the kitchen. My kitchen. The kitchen where I had raised Marcus, where I had cooked Thanksgiving dinners for 38 years, where I had stood beside my husband every morning for 4 decades while the coffee brewed. Brooke, I learned through a cheerful announcement she made one evening at dinner, had hired a kitchen designer. "We're going to do white shaker cabinets," she said. "And a waterfall island. The green countertops have to go. They're very 90s. I said. "Those countertops are honed granite. Richard and I chose them in 1993. They're in excellent condition." Brooke said. "That's exactly my point." She smiled at me the way a flight attendant smiles at a passenger in the exit row. Marcus at the other end of the table said, "Mom, we'll pick out the replacements together. It'll be fun." We did not pick out the replacements together. I came home from a doctor's appointment one afternoon to find a construction crew demolishing the kitchen where I had made my son's birthday cakes. My cookbooks were in a cardboard box on the dining room floor. The green granite countertops, the countertops Richard had surprised me with while I was visiting my sister in 1993, were being carried out to a dumpster in pieces. I stood in the doorway of my own home for a long time that afternoon before anyone noticed I had come in. When Brooke finally saw me, she waved with a set of paint swatches in her hand and called out, cheerful as a weather report, "Isn't this exciting? We're making this place yours again." Her exact words. "We are making this place yours again. In my own house. Over the body of the kitchen I had lived in for 38 years. I said, "That's lovely, dear." And I went upstairs and I closed my bedroom door. And I sat on the edge of the bed I had shared with my husband for 43 years, and I did not cry. I picked up a pen and a small leather notebook I had started keeping in the top drawer of my nightstand, and I wrote the date and the time in a single sentence. Today they removed the kitchen. And then I underlined it. Twice. The bedroom was the third thing. I had a small hospital stay that August, a routine procedure, nothing serious, but Marcus had insisted I stay overnight for observation. I was gone from the house for exactly 26 hours. When I came home, my bedroom had been repainted. Brooke had also, during those 26 hours, moved my belongings into the smallest guest room at the back of the house. The one over the garage. The one Richard's mother had stayed in when she visited. The one with the dormer window that stuck in humid weather. The one where the light was bad and the ceiling sloped so I could only stand up straight in the middle of the room. My clothes were hanging in the guest room closet. My jewelry box was on the guest room dresser. Richard's photograph, the one that had stood on my nightstand for 2 years, was on the bedside table of a room I had not agreed to sleep in. Brooke met me at the top of the stairs. She had a folder in her hand because Brooke always had a folder in her hand, and she walked me cheerfully down the hall to the room she had prepared for me. "We thought you'd be more comfortable here," she said. "The master is really a better fit for a couple. And this way you have your own little retreat. Isn't it sweet?" I looked at the folder in her hand. I said, "Brooke, what is that?" She said, "Oh, just some paperwork. I've been organizing things. I'll show you later." I did not look at the folder later. I did not need to. I knew what was in the folder. Folders like that one were the folders I had spent 43 years arguing against in courtrooms and conference rooms, and around kitchen tables belonging to families who had come to me too late. Folders that contained quitclaim deeds or powers of attorney, or representations of authority. Folders that represented the slow, patient, administrative theft of an elderly woman's home by people who lived in it. I did not sleep in my own bedroom that night. I slept in the guest room over the garage, the room with the sloping ceiling, and I lay in the dark and I listened to Brooke and Marcus moving around in the bedroom Richard and I had slept in for 43 years. And I thought about the Hartwell provision. And I thought about Harold Whitmore. And I thought about a promise I had made to a dying man on our porch in the spring of the year before last. And I did not sleep, but I did not cry. I had made my decision. I was going to watch. I was going to wait. And I was going to choose the moment. The only person in the house who saw me, truly saw me, during those 18 months was my grandson. Noah was 12 then, quiet and careful and much too thin, with Richard's exact eyes and his mother's careful manners. Brooke had no interest in him. She had no interest in any child that had not come out of her own body, and she had no children, and so Noah was, as far as she was concerned, A piece of collateral damage she had inherited along with my son. She did not mistreat him exactly. She simply did not see him. She bought him the clothes he needed and signed the forms from school and remembered his birthday within a reasonable margin of error. And the rest of the time, Noah was invisible to her the way the maid was invisible, the way I was becoming invisible. Marcus noticed this the way Marcus noticed everything his wife did, which is to say, he noticed it and he did not speak of it. So Noah belonged to me. Or rather, Noah and I belonged to each other. I took him to school some mornings when Brooke was busy. I picked him up from the library on Saturdays. I made him grilled cheese sandwiches in the hideous new kitchen while Brooke was at her yoga class. I asked him about his books, which were science fiction novels that were too old for him and that he devoured anyway. I asked him about his friends, which were few and quiet and mostly also readers. I asked him how he was feeling, which was a question his stepmother had never asked him in 7 years. And sometime in the middle of that first winter they lived in my house, Noah began to talk to me. He would come find me in my guest room retreat in the late afternoons, after his homework, and he would sit on the floor beside my little armchair, and he would tell me things. He told me that Brooke had thrown away the small wooden train his grandfather had carved for him when he was 4. She said it was clutter, he said matter-of-factly. He told me that his father had promised to take him to the Franklin Institute for a special exhibit, and then had forgotten, and then had told him they would go next weekend instead, and then they had never gone. He told me that Brooke had said the week before that his mother had been a very anxious person. Those were her exact words. A 12-year-old boy, being told about his dead mother by the woman who had replaced her. I sat in my armchair and I listened, and I did not say the things I wanted to say, because 12-year-old boys do not need to hear 71-year-old grandmothers spill their rage. 12-year-old boys need to be heard. So I listened. And one afternoon in early spring, Noah looked up at me from the floor of the guest room and said, "Grandma, are you going to leave?" I said, "Why would I leave, sweetheart?" He said, "Because this isn't really your house anymore." The words went through me like a cold wind. I looked at my grandson, at Richard's eyes in his small serious face, and I said, "Noah, this will always be my house. And as long as it is my house, you will always have a place in it. I need you to remember that, no matter what anyone else tells you." "All right." He looked at me a long time. And then he nodded. And then he said, "Okay, Grandma." And he went back to his book. And that evening at dinner, while Brooke was telling a long story about a woman in her Pilates class who had ordered the wrong size of window treatments, I looked across the table at my grandson, and I made myself a second promise, to go along with the one I had already made to my husband. I was going to choose the moment. And when I chose it, Noah was going to watch it, and he was going to understand for the rest of his life that the woman they had dismissed as a fragile old widow had been holding the deed to their entire world in her hand the whole time. I kept the little leather notebook in the top drawer of my nightstand. I wrote in it most nights before bed, in the small precise handwriting I had developed during 43 years of taking depositions. August 14, 2023. Bedroom repainted without consultation. Belongings relocated to guest room over garage. September 22, 2023. Brooke referred to herself as woman of the house in conversation with neighbor. October 8, 2023. Marcus signed for a delivery of patio furniture, which Brooke had ordered using my address but the credit card of her own account. Patio furniture was placed on the deck Richard built in 1995. November 30, 2023. At Thanksgiving dinner, Brooke seated me at the far end of the table, next to the 11-year-old son of her friend Tiffany. My grandson Noah was also seated at the far end of the table. Marcus did not mention this. February 4, 2024. Brooke hired a landscaper to refresh the backyard. The landscaper removed 7 of my rose bushes without my knowledge or consent. When I objected, Brooke said, "Oh, Evelyn, they were practically dead. I thought we were doing you a favor." I wrote each entry in pen. I dated each entry. I noted the time. I did this because I had been a lawyer for 43 years, and I had learned from watching other women's daughters-in-law that the thing the law needed most in cases like this was not outrage. The law needed a timeline. The law needed dates and specific actions and specific statements, and the slow accumulation of ordinary cruelty documented in ordinary ink. I was building a record. I was building it quietly in my guest room over the garage, In the hours when Brooke was at her yoga class and Marcus was at his office, and I was building it for a purpose I had not yet fully admitted to myself. Harold Whitmore came to dinner one Sunday evening in early September of that year. About 14 months after Marcus and Brooke had moved in. He came because I had invited him. He came because I had told him over the phone a few days before that I thought it was time for him to see. Harold is 74 years old, with a full head of white hair and the kind of courtly manners men in his generation used to wear as armor against the modern world. He arrived in a dark suit. He brought flowers for me, and a bottle of good red wine for the table, and he shook Brooke's hand with exactly the right amount of warmth. Brooke was thrilled to have a guest. Brooke loved an opportunity to perform the role of hostess in a house that had been the scene of 3 decades of my own hosting. She had set the table with the good china, my good china, which she now referred to as the china we have. She served beef bourguignon and a complicated asparagus dish, and she laughed at Harold's jokes, and she told him charming stories about her home renovation projects. Harold smiled politely, and he ate his asparagus and he watched. He watched the way Brooke directed the conversation. He watched the way Marcus agreed with every single thing his wife said. He watched the way Brooke introduced me to an old friend who had known me for 31 years, as my mother-in-law, who's been kind enough to let us stay with her while we get on our feet. Her exact words. He watched the way Noah sat silent at the far end of the table. And when dinner was over, and I walked Harold to his car in the circular driveway Richard and I had laid with our own hands in 1984, Harold stopped at the driver's side door, and he turned to me in the porch light, and he said very quietly, "Evelyn, how long has this been going on?" I said, 14 months. He said, "Is the trust structure still intact?" I said, "Every piece of it." He said, "Do they know?" I said, "They do not." He looked at me a long moment. And then he said, "Evelyn, forgive me. This is not my business to ask. But what are you waiting for?" I looked at the house, at the warm yellow light in the windows of the rooms they had renovated, at the silhouette of my grandson moving through the upstairs hallway, and I said, "I'm waiting for them to reach for something they can't unreach for. Because right now, Harold, if I move, I'm the unreasonable mother-in-law who turned on her son. I need them to do the thing that tells the whole story by itself." He nodded slowly. He opened his car door. Before he got in, he said, "Evelyn, you were always the best strategist in the firm. Richard used to say it and I never disagreed. When they reach you, call me. I'll be there within 3 hours wherever you are." I said, "I will." And I watched his taillights go down the driveway, and I went back inside the house where Brooke was loading my grandmother's dishes into a dishwasher she had installed without asking me, and I said good night to her, and I went upstairs to my guest room, and I made an entry in the notebook. Harold witnessed. The record is no longer just mine. Here is what Brooke did not know. She did not know that I had been a partner at Hartwell and Whitmore for 37 of my 43 years of practice. She thought I had been, in her words, a paralegal or something at Richard's firm. I had corrected her once when she made this assumption at a holiday dinner in the 2nd year of their marriage, and Marcus, my own son, had said, "Well, Mom, you weren't really practicing at the end." As if the 6 months I had taken off during Richard's chemotherapy erased 37 years of senior partnership. I had not corrected either of them again. Some corrections are more useful saved. She did not know that the commercial real estate holding company I had mentioned earlier, the one I controlled the sole voting share of, owned a 4-story office building in Center City, Philadelphia. A building whose 3rd floor was leased to a mid-size financial consulting firm. A firm called Ashford Partners. A firm where my son Marcus worked as a senior vice president. I had been his landlord for almost 3 years. He had no idea. Richard and Harold and I had structured the holding company in such a way that the ownership was not easily traceable. Marcus worked in the building his parents owned. He had no idea. She did not know that the life insurance policy Richard and I had maintained for the entirety of our marriage had paid out, upon his death, a sum that had funded Noah's educational trust, a trust whose existence neither Marcus nor Brooke had been informed of because Richard, in his will, had simply left personal effects and the residue of the marital estate to me, the surviving spouse, with a brief clause indicating that I was to distribute as I saw fit. Marcus had read the will. He had assumed, and I had let him assume, that there was no residue to speak of. He had assumed that his father had, like many men of his father's generation, been a good earner but a poor planner, and that the house was my only significant asset. He was wrong about the house, the firm, the building, the trust, and his father. He was wrong about all of it. And Brooke, who had built her entire campaign on the premise that I was a widow whose only resource was a property she could slowly talk me out of, was about to learn that the woman she had just evicted by text message was, in a very specific and legally incontrovertible sense, the wealthiest person in her family tree. I had not wanted it to come to this. You have to understand this. I had loved my son. I had hoped for 18 months that at some point Marcus would come to me, privately, without his wife in the room, and that he would say the words that would have given me a reason to stop building the record. He never came. And in the last 6 weeks, something in the household had shifted, and I had felt it the way a woman of my age feels the barometric pressure drop before a storm. Brooke had become, if possible, more confident. Marcus had become more absent. The folder I had seen in her hand on the afternoon she moved me into the guest room had been joined, I was fairly certain, by other folders. There had been a specific Tuesday in early October when I had come home from the grocery store and found Brooke standing in the study, my study, the room in the back of the house where I kept my personal files, and she had smiled at me too brightly and said, "Oh, I was just looking for the bills," and I had known, in the way a 43-year attorney knows, that she had not been looking for the bills. I had gone back upstairs. I had opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. I had checked the small locked fireproof box where I kept the originals of the Hartwell provision documents. The box had been untouched. Brooke had not known it was there. But she had been looking. She had been looking for something. The trip to my sister's in Vermont, the trip I was in the middle of when her text came through, had been suggested by Brooke herself 3 weeks earlier. "Margaret's been asking for you," she had said one evening. "Why don't you go up for 2 weeks? You've been cooped up in the house all summer. Marcus and I can hold down the fort." Her exact words. "Marcus and I can hold down the fort." The fort that was not theirs. I had looked at her across the hideous new kitchen island and I had thought, well, there it is. She's making the move. I had waited another week to see if she would mention it again. She had twice. On the third mention I had booked a flight. I had hugged Marcus at the door before I left. I had hugged my grandson longer. I had told Noah very quietly at the door when no one was watching, "Sweetheart, if anything strange happens while I'm gone, I want you to call me. Any hour. Day or night. Do you have my cell number memorized?" He had nodded. He had said, "Yes, Grandma." He had looked at me with Richard's eyes and he had said, "You're coming back though, right?" I had said, "Noah, I will always come back." I flew to Vermont on a Tuesday morning. I spent 2 days with my sister, walking in the woods behind her house, drinking her coffee, eating her pie, saying almost nothing about what was happening in Philadelphia, because Margaret had seen enough over the 18 months to know most of it without being told, and I had not yet decided how much to say. On Wednesday evening, Noah called me on my cell phone. His voice was very small. He said, "Grandma, Brooke is packing up your clothes." I said, "Noah, tell me exactly what you saw." He said, "She took the empty boxes out of the basement, the ones that were in the garage, and she's in the guest room over the garage, and she's putting your clothes in them, the ones from your closet, and she told me to go play outside, but I came back and I looked through the door and I could see." I said, "All right, sweetheart. All right. Thank you for calling me. Don't let her know you called me. Can you do that?" He said, "Okay, Grandma." I said, "Noah, I need you to do one more thing. I need you to go into my room after she's finished. I need you to look in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. There is a small black metal box. I need you to tell me quietly when it's safe whether the box is still there. I need to know if she opened it." He said, "Okay." An hour later he called me back. "The box is still there, Grandma," he whispered. "She didn't find it. It's in the back of the drawer behind the other things." I checked. I said, "Noah, I love you. Go to sleep. I'll see you soon." The next afternoon, the text from Brooke came through. "Evelyn, Marcus and I have discussed this at length. The current living arrangement is no longer working for our family. Your belongings will be placed in storage by the end of the week. Please arrange alternate accommodation. This is no longer your home. Brooke." I set the phone face down on my sister's kitchen counter. I looked out at the copper leaves on the maple tree in Vermont. I thought for one long quiet moment about the Hartwell provision, about the building in Center City, about the trust for Noah, about the bottom drawer of my nightstand, about the promise I had made to my husband on the porch of our house on a spring evening before his first chemotherapy appointment. And I picked up the phone. And I called Harold Whitmore. And when Margaret walked in with her pie knife still in her hand, I looked at her and I said very calmly, "I'm driving home tonight. Before the sun comes up, my daughter-in-law is going to wake up in a house she does not own, married to a man whose salary comes from an office building I am about to give notice to, and she is going to discover that the boy she has been failing for 7 years is the richest member of her family. I want to be there when she understands." Margaret set the pie knife down. She looked at me for a very long moment. And then my sister, who had been a second-grade teacher for 36 years, who had never raised her voice in her life, smiled the slow cold smile I had last seen on her face in 1962 when our older brother had tried to take the last piece of chocolate cake off her plate, and she said, "Ev, what do you need me to do?" I said, "I need you to stay here. I need you to answer your phone if I call. And I need you to remember if anyone ever asks, that I walked into your kitchen this afternoon, read the text with my own eyes, and made every single decision that came next with perfect clarity." She said, "I remember." I said, "I'm going to go pack." I walked out of her kitchen. I went down the hall to the guest room. I opened my small overnight bag on the bed where our mother's quilt was still folded at the foot. I packed everything I had brought. I picked up my phone. I opened the last message from Brooke. I read it one more time just to be sure that I remembered each word exactly. Then I opened a new message and I typed 3 words and I sent them back to her. And I set the phone down on the dresser and I zipped my bag closed. The 3 words I sent were, "I'm on my way." I pulled out of my sister's driveway at 6:48 that evening. The rain had started somewhere around Burlington, a steady, patient rain that came in silver sheets across the highway, and by the time I crossed into Massachusetts it had settled into the kind of rhythm that keeps a woman company on a long drive. I had made this drive exactly twice before in my life. Once when our mother died in 1994, and once when Richard's cancer diagnosis came through on a Monday afternoon and I had been in Vermont visiting Margaret and had gotten the call in her kitchen and had driven home that same night without stopping. Both times I had driven in a state of numb grief. This time I drove with a notebook open on the passenger seat beside me, and every 20 or 30 miles I would glance over at it and think of another item to add. I was not grieving anymore. I had done my grieving in the guest room over the garage for 18 months, quietly, in small precise handwriting in a leather notebook. What I was doing now was something else entirely. Harold called me from his home in Bryn Mawr at 9 o'clock. "Evelyn, where are you?" he asked. "Just south of Hartford," I said. "You'll be in by 3 at this rate," he said. "For if I stop for coffee. Do you want me to meet you at the house tonight?" he asked. "I want you to be at the front door at 6:30 in the morning," I said. "With the full file. With the originals of the trust documents. With the notice of tenancy termination for Ashford Partners, signed and ready for service. With the certified copy of the deed in my name. And Harold. Yes. I want Sheriff Kelleher there too. 2 deputies. Not a scene but presence. They are not to come to the door. They are to wait in the drive until I call them in." Harold was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You're not going to give them a chance to move the conversation, are you?" "No," I said. "I am not. I have given them 18 months of chances." He said, "Drive safely, Evelyn." I said, "I intend to." I drove through Connecticut. I crossed the George Washington Bridge at 1:47 in the morning, the lights of Manhattan laid out to my right, and I thought of all the times Richard and I had crossed that bridge together on the way home from a Broadway show or a dinner with one of his college friends, and I did not cry, but I did allow myself one long slow breath. The rain was easing by the time I crossed into New Jersey. By the time I reached the Pennsylvania line it had stopped entirely, and the sky ahead of me was beginning that particular color that is not quite dawn but no longer fully night, a color the color of a bruise that has started to heal. I pulled off the turnpike at a rest stop outside Trenton at 3:20, and I ordered a cup of black coffee, and I sat in a plastic booth under a fluorescent light and I opened my notebook and I wrote 2 more entries. October 26, 9:47 p.m. Sent reply, I'm on my way to Brooke. No response. October 27, 3:22 a.m. Approaching Philadelphia. The record is complete. I closed the notebook. I drank my coffee. I drove the last hour home. I pulled into my own neighborhood at 4:41 in the morning. The streets of Chestnut Hill were empty, and the air had that particular October stillness that always reminded me of Richard carrying Marcus home from a late October birthday party when Marcus was 4 years old, asleep on his father's shoulder, his small sneakered feet dangling. Chestnut Hill at 4 in the morning in late October is a very specific place. I did not drive to my house. I drove past it. I drove past the end of my own driveway, and I saw the light on in the master bedroom upstairs, the bedroom Richard and I had shared for 43 years, and I saw Brooke's silver SUV parked in the spot where Richard's truck had sat for 25 years, and I kept driving. I drove 4 blocks to a small all-night diner called Mel's that had been there since 1971. I parked. I went inside. I ordered a fresh coffee and an English muffin, and I sat in a booth by the window where I could watch the sun come up over the roofs of the houses on Germantown Avenue, and I waited. Harold had a key to my house. Harold had had a key to my house for 31 years, because Harold had been Richard's best friend and law partner and a man who had helped move furniture and set up Christmas trees and eat Thanksgiving dinner at our table for 3 decades. Brooke did not know this. Brooke did not know a great many things. At 5:55 in the morning I paid my check. I drove the 4 blocks home. I pulled into my driveway. Harold was already there in his own car, and so was the sheriff's department vehicle, parked at the curb 2 houses down, exactly where I had asked. Harold got out of his car when I pulled in. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he wore to court, and he was holding a slim leather portfolio that I knew, because I had built it with him 18 months ago, contained the documents that were going to end this. I got out of my car. The morning air was sharp, and my breath showed in it. I walked across my own driveway, past the flagstones Richard and I had laid together in 1984, past the dogwoods we had planted when Marcus was born, and I stopped in front of Harold. He said, "Evelyn." I said, "Harold." He said, "You're certain?" I said, "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He handed me a second key. "The locksmith came at 5, he said. "Rear garage door, both front and back primary locks, the side gate, and the pedestrian door on the garage. New cylinders, new codes. Here's yours. The old keys will not work." I took the key. I slipped it into the pocket of my coat, and then I walked up the front steps of my own house at 6:02 in the morning, and I unlocked the front door that was already unlocked, because Brooke had never quite believed that Chestnut Hill needed to be locked, and I stepped into my own foyer for the first time in 11 days. The house smelled of Brooke. That is the only way to describe it. It smelled of the candle she burned from a store in the King of Prussia Mall. It smelled of the diffuser she kept on the hall console. It smelled of coffee from the automatic machine she had installed in the kitchen counter I had lived with for 18 months. It did not smell like my house. I stood in my own foyer a moment and I listened. Upstairs a shower was running. That would be Brooke. Brooke showered every morning at 6 o'clock. She had a Pilates class at 7:30 on Fridays. Somewhere else in the house a television was on very quietly. That would be Marcus in the kitchen, watching the morning financial news while he made his coffee. He had started doing this sometime in the last year, watching CNBC at 6 a.m., as if watching the markets open would somehow make his own career more substantial than it was. I put my overnight bag down at the bottom of the stairs. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook where Richard's coat had hung for 43 years, where Brooke had hung her own coat since the afternoon they moved in. I walked through my dining room, past my mother's china cabinet, past the wall where Richard had installed the picture rail in 1987 for the portraits of Marcus at various ages, portraits that had been replaced over the last 18 months, with black and white photographs of Brooke's family on various vacations. I walked into my kitchen. Marcus was standing at the island with his back to the doorway, in the short silk robe Brooke had bought him for Christmas last year, a pot of something rotating in the espresso machine. The television on the counter was muted. My son, who was 43 years old and who had not seen me for 11 days, did not turn around when I walked into the room. I think he may have heard the door. I think he may have heard my footsteps on the hardwood floor of his mother's dining room. I think it had simply not occurred to him that the footsteps he was hearing could be mine, because I was supposed to be in Vermont, reading Brooke's text message in horrified confusion, searching for an apartment, making phone calls to movers. I said, "Good morning, Marcus." He turned around so fast he knocked his coffee cup off the edge of the island. The cup hit the new white tile floor and shattered. He stared at me. He looked at me the way a man looks at a ghost he does not yet realize he has caused. He said, "Mom." I said, "Good morning, dear. I see you've made yourself right at home." He said, "Mom, what are you doing here?" I said, "I live here, Marcus." He said, "No, Brooke sent you." He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. He did not know yet whether to pretend he did not know about the text or to admit that he had approved it. He stood there in his wife's bathrobe in my kitchen with coffee on the floor, and he looked, for the first time in a very long time, like the little boy I had raised. I said, "Marcus, go upstairs. Get dressed. Ask Brooke to come down. We have company." He said, "Company? Mom, it's 6 in the morning." I said, "I am aware of what time it is. Please do as I asked." He hesitated. And then something in my tone, something that had been a partner at Hartwell and Whitmore for 37 years, something that he had last heard in his mother's voice when he was 16 years old and had taken the car without permission, made him turn around and walk up the stairs. He did not bring a broom for the coffee. He left it where it was. I did not clean up the coffee either. I walked back out to the foyer. I opened the front door. I nodded to Harold, who was standing on the porch with his portfolio. He came in. I nodded past him to the sheriff's car at the curb. 2 deputies got out. Sheriff Kelleher himself was in the front seat in uniform, a man I had known for 20 years because he had been Richard's duck hunting partner, and he gave me a small tip of his hat and stayed where he was. The deputies walked up the driveway and stopped at the foot of the porch steps, one on each side, and they did not come up. Harold followed me into the dining room. I sat down at the head of the table. Harold sat to my right. He opened his portfolio on the table in front of him. Inside were 5 documents, each in a clear protective sleeve. I did not look at them. I did not need to. I had drafted 2 of them myself. I heard Brooke's footsteps coming down the stairs. She was moving fast. She was talking low and furious to Marcus behind her. I heard her say, "I don't care what she says, the legal letter was sent yesterday, she has no ground to stand on." Her exact words. The legal letter was sent yesterday. So, she had sent a letter too in addition to the text. A letter I had not yet received, because I had been driving through the night. I filed this information away the way I had filed every piece of information for 18 months. She came into the dining room in a pink athletic outfit, her hair damp from the shower, her phone in her hand, and she stopped short when she saw me sitting at the head of my own dining room table, and next to me a man in a charcoal suit she had never seen before. Her expression went through a series of small rapid calculations, and I watched each one. Surprise. Recognition that something had gone off script. A quick search for the right face to put on. She chose, as I had known she would, the face of a woman in command of a situation. She said, "Evelyn, I didn't know you were coming home today." I said, "No, you didn't." Marcus came in behind her. He had put on pants at least and a sweater. He did not sit down. He stood behind Brooke's chair like a man waiting for permission. Brooke looked at Harold. She said, "Who is this?" I said, "This is Harold Whitmore. He was your father-in-law's law partner for 31 years. He is also my attorney and has been for a very long time. Harold, this is Brooke. I believe you met at the dinner in September." Harold inclined his head politely. He did not stand. He said, "Mrs. Hartwell." Brooke sat down at the table. She did not sit at the foot. She sat in the chair to my left, directly across from Harold, which she had taught herself over the last 18 months to think of as her own place at this table. She set her phone face down on the polished wood. She said, "Evelyn, I'm glad you're home. I think we should probably talk about the letter." I said, "What letter?" She said, "The letter my attorney sent you yesterday. To your sister's address. A formal 30-day notice. Marcus and I have decided that it's time for you to have your own space. I think once you read the letter, you'll see that we've been more than fair. We've offered to cover the first 3 months of rent at an assisted living community we think is very nice, in Bala Sinwad. Her exact words. Assisted living community. Bala Sinwit. I looked at Marcus. Marcus was staring at the table. Marcus would not meet my eyes. Brooke continued. She said, "We've also taken the liberty of contacting a moving company. They'll be here on Monday. Everything of yours has been cataloged and photographed. We've been very careful. Nothing has been thrown away." I said, "Brooke, before you go any further, I want to make sure I understand. You are informing me that you have, in conjunction with an attorney, initiated eviction proceedings against me from my own home." She said, "Oh, Evelyn, let's not use that word. Nobody is being evicted. We're simply transitioning you to a more appropriate setting. You've been through so much in the last 2 years. You shouldn't be responsible for a house this size." I said, "This house is my responsibility, Brooke. This house has been my responsibility for 43 years. She smiled. She smiled the way she had smiled at me the afternoon she moved me into the guest room over the garage. She said, "Evelyn, and this is the hard part, I understand this is difficult to hear. The house isn't really yours anymore in the way you're thinking of it. Marcus and I have been covering all of the operating expenses for the last 18 months. The utilities, the property taxes, the insurance. We've been carrying this house. And frankly, we don't think it makes financial sense for us to continue to carry it when the person who lives in it is going to inherit it anyway. Marcus is your only child. It's all going to come to him eventually. All we're doing is speeding up a conversation that was already going to happen." I let her finish. I let her say every single word. This was important. Harold next to me did not move. I said, "Brooke, I want to make sure I have the chain of events clear in my mind. Yesterday afternoon, while I was at my sister's house in Vermont, you sent me a text message informing me that this is no longer my home." She said, "Evelyn, that was an informal." I said, "Yesterday afternoon, in conjunction with that text message, you sent a formal notice via an attorney to my sister's address, communicating a 30-day eviction." She said, "Notice of transition." I said, "You have, in the last several days or weeks, begun packing my personal belongings into boxes." She said, "Organizing." I said, "Brooke, please stop interrupting me. I want to complete my summary. You have, according to what you just said, contacted a moving company. You have arranged for, in your words, an assisted living community in Bala Sinwit. You have at some point engaged with an attorney in this process." She said, "Yes." I said, "Marcus, you signed off on all of this." He did not look up. He said, "Mom, we talked about it. Brooke explained it to me. She said we needed to do this before you got worse." He said, "Before you got worse." My own son. In front of an attorney. In my own dining room. I did not react to this. I had learned, over 43 years, that there is a moment in every serious negotiation when the other side will hand you something so clean you could cut yourself on it, and the correct response to that moment is to accept it quietly and proceed. I said, "Before I got worse. I see. Harold." Harold opened his portfolio. He removed the first document from its sleeve. He said, "Mrs. Hartwell, this is a certified copy of the deed to this house, 1847 Willowmere Lane, Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. You will note that the title is held by the Hartwell Family Trust. The sole trustee of the Hartwell Family Trust, since the death of Richard Hartwell on March 8, 2023, is Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell. You will also note that the sole contingent beneficiary of the Hartwell Family Trust upon Mrs. Hartwell's death is her grandson, Noah Hartwell. Marcus Hartwell is not named in this document in any capacity. Neither are you." He slid the document across the table. Brooke did not touch it. She looked at it the way a woman looks at a snake in her garden. Marcus behind her made a small sound. Harold removed the second document. "This is a certified copy of Richard Hartwell's will, on file at the Orphans Court of Philadelphia County since April of last year. You will note that the residue of the marital estate was left to Mrs. Hartwell, as the surviving spouse, with full discretion as to distribution. Mr. Marcus Hartwell, you will recall, sat in Mr. Whitmore's office last April while this will was read aloud. You signed a document acknowledging receipt and comprehension. Your signature is on page 4. Brooke turned her head very slowly to look at her husband. Marcus said, I didn't know there was anything in the residue." Harold said. There was a very substantial residue, Mr. Hartwell. We can discuss that in a moment. He removed the third document. This is the operating agreement for Willowmere Holdings, LLC, a Pennsylvania limited liability company. Willowmere Holdings owns a commercial office building at 1540 Market Street, Philadelphia. The sole voting member of Willowmere Holdings, since the restructuring of September 2022, is Evelyn Hartwell. The building is currently leased to 4 tenants. One of those tenants on the 3rd floor is Ashford Partners. Brooke said. What? Harold ignored her. He placed the document in front of me. He removed the 4th document. This, he said, is a notice of non-renewal. The current lease held by Ashford Partners on the 3rd floor of 1540 Market Street expires on February 28th of this coming year. Under Section 14 of the lease, the landlord is required to provide written notice of non-renewal no later than 120 days prior to the expiration date. That deadline is November 1st, 5 days from now. This notice has been drafted for Mrs. Hartwell's signature. If signed and served today, it is effective immediately. Ashford Partners will not have its lease renewed. He placed the document in front of me. He took out a pen from his breast pocket. Marcus said, Mom, wait. He came around the table. He came around toward my chair. One of the deputies on the porch must have seen him move through the window, because at that moment I saw the second deputy step up onto the porch. Marcus stopped. He said, Mom, you can't. The firm. If we lose this office, I'm up for partner in March. I said, Marcus, sit down. He sat down. In the chair at the foot of the table. The chair he had sat in as a boy. I said, I am not punishing you for being up for partner, Marcus. I am holding you accountable for what you allowed to happen in this house. The two are not the same thing, but they are both real. Harold removed the 5th document. This, he said, is the trust instrument for the Noah Hartwell Educational and Living Trust, established by Richard and Evelyn Hartwell on September 22, 2022, and funded upon Richard Hartwell's death by the proceeds of a life insurance policy Richard Hartwell maintained throughout his marriage. The current principal balance of the trust, as of the most recent statement, is $2,416,000. Noah Hartwell is the sole beneficiary. Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell is the sole trustee. Mrs. Hartwell has discretion over distributions for educational expenses, living expenses, medical expenses, and any other reasonable need of the beneficiary until the beneficiary reaches the age of 30, at which point the trust terminates and the remaining balance is distributed outright to Noah Hartwell. Neither of you under any circumstance has access to, control over, or standing to contest this trust. He placed the document in front of me. For the first time since she had walked into the dining room, Brooke was silent. Her face had gone the color of the new quartz countertops she had installed in my kitchen. Marcus said very quietly, $2 million. Harold said, $2,416,000. As of September, it has been invested conservatively. It has grown substantially since it was funded. Marcus said, Dad had that. Dad had that kind of life insurance. I said, your father worked for 47 years, Marcus. He was the senior partner at a firm he founded. He carried disability insurance and life insurance and long-term care insurance on both of us for the entirety of our marriage. Your father also, as you would know if you had visited him more than 4 times in the 9 months he was dying, spent the last 6 months of his life making sure that his grandson would never have to depend on the kindness of a woman who referred to his dead mother as a very anxious person. Marcus flinched. Brooke said, I never said that. I said, you said it to Noah on the afternoon of February 14th of this year, in the kitchen, while Noah was making himself a sandwich. I was in the pantry. You did not know I was in the pantry. Noah did not know I was in the pantry. I wrote it down. Brooke's phone, face down on the table, began to buzz. She did not pick it up. Harold said, Mrs. Hartwell, if you are prepared, we can begin. I said, I am prepared. He slid the notice of non-renewal for Ashford Partners across the table to me. He handed me the pen. I signed. Marcus made a small sound, a sound that was not a word. Brooke said, Marcus, the firm, Marcus, your bonus. Her voice rising. I said, Harold, please serve that personally at the Market Street office at 9 o'clock this morning. Have the process server photograph the delivery. Harold made a small note in his portfolio. He said, yes. He slid the second document across the table to me. A document Brooke had not yet seen. A document that had been drafted 3 weeks earlier, the morning after Brooke had suggested I visit my sister in Vermont. I signed it. Harold said aloud for the benefit of the room. That is a notice of formal termination of permissive residency. Mr. Marcus Hartwell and Mrs. Brooke Hartwell are hereby notified that their permission to reside at 1847 Willowmere Lane is terminated effective immediately. They have until 6 o'clock this evening to remove their personal belongings from the property. Any items remaining on the property after 6 p.m. will be placed in storage at a facility of Mrs. Hartwell's choosing, at Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Hartwell's expense. The locks have already been changed. The security system has been recoded. Sheriff's deputies are on the premises to ensure an orderly transition. Brooke stood up. She said, you can't do this. I said, Brooke, I want to be very careful with you right now, because you have said a number of things in the last 18 months that I would like you to hear said back to you in the correct order. I stood up. I walked around the table. I did not walk toward her. I walked to the window behind her chair, the window that looked out over the back garden, where 7 rose bushes had been removed in February by a landscaper she had hired. I said, you told my neighbor at the holiday party in December that you were the woman of the house. You told a friend from your Pilates class, in this very dining room in August, that you were making this place yours. You informed my son, when he suggested that his mother might want to be consulted on the kitchen renovation, that Evelyn will come around. She always does. Those were your exact words. I was on the other side of the pantry wall. I wrote them down. Brooke said, you were spying on us. I said, I was living in my own house, dear. You were the one who was unaware. I turned to face her. You told Noah 2 weeks ago that his grandmother's memory was, in your words, slipping, and that this house was becoming too much for me, and that I was going to be much happier in a smaller place. You said this to a 12-year-old boy at the kitchen table, while you were making him pretend to do his homework, so you could have an opportunity to deliver the information to him before you delivered it to me. Brooke said, I said. And finally, at 4:47 yesterday afternoon, while I was drying a coffee cup at my sister's kitchen sink in Vermont, you sent me a text message that read, and I am going to read this into the record. One moment. I took my phone out of my pocket. I unlocked it. I read the message aloud, all 4 sentences slowly, in the tone I had used for 43 years to read back, in court and in conference rooms, the exact words of people who had assumed no one was keeping track. When I reached the last sentence, I paused. I said, Brooke, this is no longer your home. She sat down. She sat down hard in the chair behind her, the one she had been standing in front of, and she did not seem to have decided to sit down. Her legs simply stopped holding her up. Marcus said, Mom, please. I said, Marcus, you are my son. I am not going to make you homeless today. You may move into the guest room at Harold's house tonight, until you find an apartment. Harold has agreed to this. You may take the clothes you need. You may not take anything from the main rooms of the house. You may not take anything from the bedroom that was mine before you moved me to the room over the garage. Brooke will be required to vacate by 6 o'clock tonight. Any belongings she cannot carry in a single suitcase will be placed in storage at her expense. Marcus said, Mom, I'm her husband. I said, Marcus, that is a matter for you and Brooke to work out. I am not asking you to divorce your wife. I am telling you that your wife is no longer welcome to sleep under the roof she tried to steal from the mother of the man she married. If you would like to accompany her tonight, that is your choice. You are welcome at Harold's, or you are welcome to accompany your wife to a hotel. I am not going to tell you what to do. I am not your wife, and I am not going to be. Marcus said, Mom, I said, and Noah. Brooke's head came up. I said, Noah is not going anywhere. Noah has a trust. Noah has a grandmother. Noah has a school that is a 15-minute walk from this house, and he has been walking it alone for 2 years, and he is not going to be uprooted because the two of you have finally done the thing that makes the rest of this easy. Noah will remain in this house. I will remain in this house. You, Marcus, will have supervised visitation with your son on weekends, at Harold's office, until I am satisfied that you can be trusted to put him ahead of your wife. Brooke, you will have no contact with Noah at all. That is non-negotiable. Brooke said, You can't take my son. I said, He is not your son, Brooke. He has never been your son. You reminded him of this every day for 7 years. The paperwork has already been filed, as of Wednesday afternoon, for me to petition for emergency guardianship of Noah. Marcus has not yet been served. He will be served today. Marcus said. Mom. I looked at him. I said, Marcus, I am going to say this once, and then I am not going to say it again because you are 43 years old and I have said it to you in other forms enough times. You have a choice to make. You can go with Brooke this morning, and you can continue to be the man who watched his stepmother dismantle his own childhood home around his mother, who watched his wife call his mother a burden in her own kitchen, who watched his wife throw away the wooden train his father carved for his son, and you can live with that choice for the rest of your life. Or you can sit down in that chair, Marcus, and you can tell me in front of Harold and in front of your wife and in front of God, that you are sorry, and you can begin the long slow work of earning your way back into a relationship with your son and with me. I am not offering you forgiveness today. I am offering you a fork in the road. The room was silent. Brooke was staring at Marcus. Marcus was staring at the table. I said, Take your time. He did not sit down. He stood up. He looked at Brooke. He looked at me. He looked at the table where he had eaten his birthday cake every year from the ages of 1 through 17. And then he said the first true words I had heard him speak in 2 years. I have to think, Mom. I have to go somewhere and think. I said, You may sit at Mel's. They open at 5. They have excellent eggs. He said, Mom. I said, Marcus, you may go. Take your wallet and your coat. Harold will drive you. You may not take your phone. Your phone contains records of conversations between you and your wife about my finances, and I do not yet know what those records contain, and I want them preserved. Marcus hesitated, and then, slowly, he took his phone out of his pocket, and he placed it on the dining room table, face up. And he turned around and he walked out of the dining room, and he took his coat from the foyer, and he let Harold lead him to the driveway, and the second deputy followed them out to the curb, which left Brooke. Brooke, in her pink athletic outfit, with her wet hair and her expensive candles and her organized folders, sitting alone at my dining room table. Brooke, who had spent 18 months making this house hers. Brooke, whose text message, which had been the culmination of everything she had built, was sitting on my phone on the polished surface of the table in front of her. She looked at me. She said very quietly, Evelyn. I said, Brooke, you have until 6 o'clock to pack what you can carry. The deputies will remain on the property until then. You may not go into Noah's room. You may not go into the library. You may not go into the master bedroom, which is where my belongings will be returned to this afternoon. You may not remove anything from the downstairs rooms. You may go into the guest room where you have been sleeping and pack your clothes. You may go into the bathroom and pack your cosmetics. Anything that has ever belonged to me or to Richard will remain in this house. If you are unsure whether something belonged to me, leave it. Harold will arbitrate later. She said, Evelyn, please. I overstepped. I know that. But you can't just throw me out. Marcus won't stand for it. I said, Brooke. Marcus drove off in a sheriff's department vehicle 10 seconds ago. Marcus is currently deciding whether he is going to choose his wife or his mother. If he chooses you, I will be sad, but I will not be changed. And I want you to hear me because this is the last conversation we are ever going to have, that what is happening to you today is not happening because you sent me a text message yesterday. What is happening to you today is happening because on a specific Tuesday in October, I came home from the grocery store and found you in my study going through my personal files, and I realized that you had made the decision to go through my paperwork and see what you could take. You had not yet done the thing that this morning is the punishment for. But you had decided to do it. The moment you made that decision, Brooke, the moment you decided that a 71-year-old woman whose husband was dead and whose son was weak was a door you could push against to see if it would open, you made the decision I am now responding to. The text message was simply the moment you chose to push all the way through. I have been waiting for the moment. I have been writing it down. And when you chose it, I was ready. She said, I want to say something to you. I said, no, Brooke. You don't. You want to say something that will change what is happening. There is nothing you can say that will change what is happening. The documents are signed. The deputies are outside. The locks have been changed. The lease on your husband's office is being terminated at 9 o'clock this morning. Noah's trust is in place and cannot be touched. The house is in my name and my name alone. You can say whatever you want to say, Brooke, but you will be saying it on your way up the stairs to pack your suitcase. She stood up. She did not say anything in the end. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she turned and walked out of the dining room. I heard her go up the stairs. I heard a door close. I sat down at the head of my own dining room table. I looked at the 5 documents spread out across the polished wood. I looked at Marcus's phone face up. I looked at the window where, through the bare branches of the dogwoods Richard and I had planted, the sun was now coming up over my back garden. It was 6:47 in the morning. Harold would be back from dropping Marcus at the diner in 15 minutes. I heard at that moment the sound of footsteps on the staircase. Not Brooke's footsteps, which I had been tracking in the background of my attention. Smaller footsteps. Careful footsteps. My grandson appeared in the doorway of the dining room. He was in the pajamas I had given him for his birthday last year, the ones with the small blue stars on them, which he had not quite grown out of. His hair was sticking up on one side. He had Richard's exact eyes, and in those eyes, as he looked at me across my dining room in the pale first light of a Friday morning in late October, was a very particular expression I had never seen on a 12-year-old's face before. It was relief. I said, "Good morning, sweetheart." He said, "Grandma, you came back." I said, "Of course I came back. I told you I would." He crossed the dining room in 6 quick steps, and he wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and he held on very hard, and he did not cry and I did not cry, and we stayed that way for a long quiet moment with the sun coming in through the window that looked out on the garden where the last of the roses were going brown on the vine. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss a new story from Sarah Mitchell. The best ones are still coming. And the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. Noah sat down in the chair Brooke had been sitting in. I did not ask him to sit anywhere else. I pushed my cup of coffee, which Harold had poured me when he first arrived, across the table to him. "Your mother would not have approved of you drinking coffee at 12 years old," I said. "But I'm going to let you have a sip, because today is a day for new arrangements." He took a sip. He made a face. He said, "It's really bitter, Grandma." I said, "It's supposed to be." He said, "Grandma, where is Dad?" I said, "Your father is at a diner called Mel's 4 blocks away, sitting in a booth. He is thinking. He is going to have to make a choice today, Noah. I want to be honest with you about what is happening. Your stepmother is upstairs packing her things. She is not going to live in this house anymore. She is not going to be part of our lives anymore. That is the choice I am making, and it is not your choice, and I do not need you to approve it. But I want you to know the shape of what is happening." He nodded. He was a serious child. He had always been a serious child. He said, "Is Dad going to leave too?" I said, "I don't know yet, sweetheart. Your father is trying to figure that out. He may come back. He may not. If he does come back, the way we live together is going to be very different. If he does not come back, you and I are going to be fine. We are going to stay in this house. Your bedroom is going to stay your bedroom. Your school is going to stay your school. I am going to be your legal guardian. I have already signed the paperwork to do this." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Grandma, am I allowed to say something?" I said, "Noah, you are always allowed to say something." He said, "I'm glad she's leaving." He said it simply, like a 12-year-old who had been waiting for 7 years for someone to give him permission to say something true. I reached across the table and I took his hand in mine. I said, "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Outside in the driveway, a car door closed. Harold was back. I stood up. I said, "Noah, I want you to go upstairs, get dressed, and come down for breakfast. Harold is going to take you to school today. I need to be here while Brooke packs. When you come home this afternoon, I will be here, and so will your father or not, and I will tell you everything that happened." "All right," he said. "Grandma." I said, "Yes, sweetheart." He said, "Grandpa would be really proud of you." I looked at my grandson. I looked at his father's eyes in his small, serious face. I did not cry because I had decided 18 months ago that I was going to choose the moment, and this was the moment, and tears were not part of it. I said, Noah, your grandfather is proud of both of us. Now go get dressed. By 7:15, Harold had come back in and briefed me on the drive to the diner. Marcus had said almost nothing. He had sat in the passenger seat of Harold's car and looked out the window, and when Harold had pulled into the parking lot at Mel's, Marcus had said only, Harold, did she plan this? All of it. Harold had said, Marcus, your mother is the finest estate strategist I have ever worked with. She did not plan what your wife would do. She planned what she would do if your wife did it. Marcus had nodded. He had gotten out of the car. He had walked into the diner, and he had sat down at a booth by the window, and he had ordered a cup of coffee, and he had taken his phone, which he no longer had, out of a pocket that was now empty. Harold had watched him through the window for a moment. And then Harold had driven back to my house. At 7:40, a sheriff's deputy came to the front door and informed me that Mrs. Brooke Hartwell had completed packing one suitcase and was ready to be escorted off the property. I said, bring her down. Brooke came down the stairs with a single rolling suitcase, a large tote bag, and a face that had been reconstructed in the last hour into the smooth professional mask of a woman who had decided to file this entire morning under a category she could explain to herself later. She did not look at me. She walked past the dining room doorway. She walked across the foyer. She stopped at the front door. And then, because Brooke could not help herself, she turned around and she said, Evelyn, you are going to regret this. My attorney will be in touch. I said, Brooke, my attorney's name is Harold Whitmore. He has been at the same firm for 52 years. Your attorney can reach him there. She said, this is elder abuse. Harold, standing in the doorway of the dining room, actually laughed. A short, dry, unamused laugh. He said, Mrs. Hartwell, I have been a member of the Pennsylvania Bar for 52 years. In that time I have heard many things said at the end of many conversations. That, I must say, is a new one. Brooke turned and walked out the front door. The deputy closed it behind her. I heard her car start. I heard her drive away. I stood in my own foyer for a long moment. I listened to the silence. I listened to the sound of Harold making a phone call from my dining room, in a low professional voice, confirming the 9 a.m. service at Market Street. I listened to Noah upstairs getting dressed for school. I walked to the coat hooks. I took down the coat Brooke had hung there yesterday afternoon, a coat she had left behind in her rush to get out the door. I walked to the front door. I opened it. I threw the coat onto the front lawn. I closed the door. I locked it. Marcus came back at 9:30. Harold had already left for Market Street to personally serve the notice. I was sitting in the library, Richard's library, the library Brooke had turned into her office, the library I had begun to reclaim, one piece at a time, the moment she drove away. I had already taken down 3 of her framed photographs. I had already taken the flat box Swedish desk and pushed it out into the hall. I had already opened the door to the garage, where Richard's oak desk sat under its tarp, and I had looked at it for a long moment, and I had decided that tomorrow, I would ask 2 of the young men from Harold's firm to come and help me bring it back into the room where it belonged. Marcus rang the front doorbell. His own front doorbell. He did not try his key. I suppose he had assumed correctly that his key would not work. I went to the door. I opened it. He was standing on the porch in the sweater he had thrown on at 6 a.m. unshaven, his eyes red. I did not say anything. I waited. He said, Mom, I sat in the booth for 3 hours. I want to come home. I said, Marcus, this was never your home. This was our home. And for a long time it was going to be yours, and then you made it very clear that it was going to be your wife's, and that is a different thing. He said, I know. I said, I am not going to let you come back in this morning, Marcus. You are going to stay at Harold's for the next 2 weeks. You are going to give Brooke the news, whatever news you are going to give her, on your own time without using this house as leverage. At the end of 2 weeks, you and I are going to sit down at this kitchen table, and you are going to tell me what you have decided, and I am going to tell you what I am willing to accept. Do you understand? He said, Yes, Mom. I said, One more thing, Marcus. Noah is not a bargaining chip. Noah is not a piece of your marriage. Noah is my grandson and your son, and for the next 2 weeks, you are not going to speak to him about any of this unless Harold and I are present. He is 12 years old, and he has been carrying a burden for 7 years that you did not carry for him, and I will not allow you to carry it to him now in a way that serves your own grief. If you try, I will know, and I will withdraw every inch I am offering you today. Am I clear? He said, Yes, Mom. He stood on the porch. I did not invite him in. I said, Go to Harold's. Take a shower. Sleep. Call me tomorrow at noon. I love you, Marcus. I have always loved you. But you are going to have to earn your way back to this doorway. He said, I know. He turned and walked down the porch steps. The deputy was still at the curb. He would take him to Harold's. He walked down my driveway, past the dogwoods, past the flagstones his father had laid when he was born, and I watched him go, and I closed the front door and I locked it, and I sat down on the bottom step of my own staircase, and for the first time in 18 months, I let myself breathe all the way out. By noon, the notice had been served at Market Street. Harold called me from his car. He said, Evelyn, it is done. The Ashford Partners senior management received the notice personally. There was, as you might expect, a response. I said, What did they say? He said, The managing partner asked whether the notice was a negotiating position. I said, What did you tell him? Harold said, I told him that Mrs. Hartwell does not negotiate. I told him that Mrs. Hartwell has been the building's owner for 3 years, and that she has never raised the rent, and that she has been, in my professional estimation, the most gracious landlord any commercial tenant in Center City, Philadelphia has ever had. And I told him that, as of this morning, he has 125 days to relocate his firm. I said, And Marcus's status at the firm? Harold said, Evelyn, they already fired him. I was quiet a moment. I said, At what time? Harold said, The managing partner informed me that Mr. Marcus Hartwell had been placed on administrative leave pending review at 8 o'clock this morning. This was apparently related to an email Mr. Hartwell sent last week, on his work account, to his wife discussing, and I quote, the old lady's assets. The email was flagged by the firm's compliance software. The review had been scheduled for Monday. This morning, after the notice was served and the partners realized who owned their building, the review was, shall we say, accelerated. I sat on the bottom step of my staircase. I thought, not with satisfaction but with a very quiet weariness, that my son had managed to destroy his career independently, without any help from me. That the firm he worked for had been planning to fire him before I even arrived home. That Brooke, whose entire strategy had assumed that Marcus's salary was the foundation of their future, had built her coup on a foundation that was already crumbling without either of them knowing it. I said, Harold, thank you. He said, Evelyn, go take a nap. I said, I intend to. At 2:45 that afternoon, a package was delivered to my front door. It was a thick overnight envelope. I opened it. Inside was the letter Brooke had sent to my sister's address on Wednesday afternoon. The formal eviction notice. The 30-day transition. The offer of assisted living in Bala Sinwit. It had been forwarded by Margaret, who had received it at 10 o'clock that morning, opened it, read it, and FedExed it back down to me with a yellow post-it note on the front that read, in her second-grade teacher's neat handwriting, Evelyn, you have to be kidding me. Love, your sister. I held the letter a long moment. Then I walked to the kitchen. I pulled out the leather notebook I had been keeping for 18 months. I opened to a fresh page. I wrote the date and the time, and in my small precise handwriting I wrote the final entry. October 27, 2:47 p.m. The record is closed. Resolution is underway. I closed the notebook. I placed it on the counter of the hideous new kitchen I was going to renovate, for the second time next spring, back to the way Richard and I had always had it, with the green granite countertops which Harold had located because Harold found things at a salvage yard in Lancaster. And I put the kettle on. At 3:30, I heard the school bus come up the street and stop at the corner. I watched through the kitchen window as Noah walked the block and a half to the front door of our house. He was carrying his backpack. He was alone. He came up the walk, up the porch steps, and he stopped at the front door. He did not try the door. He was a careful boy. He rang the bell. I walked to the front door. I opened it. I said, "Welcome home, sweetheart." He said. "Grandma." I said, "Come in. I have cookies." And my grandson walked into our house, and I closed the door behind him, and I turned the deadbolt, and I walked with him to the kitchen, and as we sat down at the island together, Noah with his cookies and me with my tea, I understood, with a very particular clarity I had never felt before in my 71 years, that the hardest part was over, and the next part, the part that was going to last for the rest of my life, was going to be the quiet, long, patient work of actually being a grandmother to a boy who had been waiting for 7 years, for someone to see him. The house smelled like my house again. The maple tree outside my kitchen window was going copper and rust against the October sky. Somewhere in the back of the house the heater kicked on. Noah said, "Grandma, can I show you something I wrote at school?" I said, "Noah, I would love that more than anything in the world." The 2 weeks I had given Marcus turned into 3. That was my decision, not his, though he did not know it was my decision. At the end of the first 2 weeks, on a Tuesday afternoon, he called me from Harold's guest room line at exactly noon, the way I had instructed him to, and he said, "Mom, it's been 2 weeks. You said we would talk at 2 weeks." I said, "Marcus, we are going to talk in another 7 days. I have decided. You are going to use that week to do one specific thing, and I will tell you what it is." He said, "Yes, Mom." I said, "You are going to file for divorce from Brooke, or you are not. You are going to tell her before the end of this week, whichever of those 2 things you have decided. And you are going to do it without me in the room, and without Harold in the room, and without telling either of us beforehand what you have decided, because I want to see for the first time in your adult life what happens when you make a serious decision by yourself. At the end of next week, Marcus, you will come here to this house, and you will tell me what you did. And based on what you did, I will decide what the rest of our lives look like." There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said, "Mom, that's not fair." I said, "Marcus, what has been done to me in the last 18 months was not fair. What has been done to your son for 7 years was not fair. You do not get to use that word with me right now. You get to sit in your discomfort for 7 more days and make your choice. I will see you next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter, the counter that Brooke had installed, the counter I had not yet replaced because the new green granite was not going to be delivered from Lancaster for another 3 weeks, and I stood a moment in my own kitchen, and I thought about what I had just done. I had not been cruel to him. Cruelty would have been to say I had already decided, and was now simply extending the suspense. I had not decided. I genuinely did not know what Marcus would do, and I wanted to know before I made the decision about whether he could rebuild a relationship with Noah and with me. A mother who is serious about her son becoming a man has to let him stand in the cold without her. That is not cruelty. That is the last gift I had left to give him. Noah and I developed a rhythm in those 3 weeks that I believe saved both of us. He came home from school every afternoon at 3:30. He rang the bell, because I had told him to keep ringing the bell until I gave him a new key of his own, which I planned to do on his 13th birthday in February. He came into the kitchen. He had cookies and I had tea. He told me about his day. Not the weather report version he had recited at dinner for 7 years for Brooke's benefit, the version that contained no information and no opinions, but the real version. He told me about a boy in his English class who had been mean to his friend Ravi. He told me that his science teacher, Mrs. Polanski, had let the class set up a small terrarium and that Noah had been assigned the role of documenting the moss growth, which he was extremely serious about. He told me, on the Friday of the first week, that his friend Ravi had asked him whether his parents were getting a divorce, and that Noah had said, "I don't know, but my grandma is in charge now, so it's okay." Those were his exact words. "My grandma is in charge now, so it's okay." I wrote them down in the leather notebook that evening, even though the record was closed, because some sentences deserve to be preserved in the same book where you kept the evidence of what it took to earn them. In the evenings, Noah and I ate dinner at the kitchen island, because the dining room still felt like Brooke to both of us, and we had silently agreed, without discussion, that we would eat in the kitchen until we had reclaimed the dining room the way I was reclaiming the library. On the first Saturday after the morning of the reckoning, 2 young men from Harold's firm came over with a dolly, and they pulled the tarp off Richard's oak desk in the garage, and they wheeled it, with some difficulty, back through the kitchen and down the hall and into the library, and they set it down in the spot where it had sat for 36 years. Noah watched from the doorway. When the men were finished, I walked to the desk and I pulled open the top drawer. And inside was a single item I had placed there 2 days before they arrived. It was the small wooden train Richard had carved for Noah when Noah was 4 years old. Noah had told me, back in the winter of the first year of Marcus and Brooke's residence, that Brooke had thrown it away. I had not forgotten. After Brooke moved out, I had gone through the 3 large plastic bins in the basement where she had stashed items she had designated as clutter, and I had found the train at the bottom of the second bin, inside an old grocery bag, scratched but intact. I did not tell Noah I was going to do this. I simply picked it up and I placed it on the oak desk on the corner where Richard used to rest his glasses, and I did not say anything. Noah walked over. He picked up the train. He turned it over in his small hands the way his grandfather used to turn evidence over in his hands when he was examining it in a conference room. He looked up at me. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes, sweetheart." He said, "Can we keep it here?" I said, "Noah, this is where it lives." He put it back down on the corner of the desk very carefully, and he went back to the doorway, and he sat down on the floor, and he watched me for a long time while I unpacked the last of Richard's law books from the cardboard boxes in the attic marked "Attic, Dad." Marcus filed for divorce from Brooke on the Thursday of the 3rd week. He did not tell me he had done it. Harold told me. Harold had, by that point, been discreetly monitoring the Philadelphia court filings on my behalf, which is the kind of favor Harold did for me without being asked, because Harold had loved Richard and had known me for 31 years and understood that there were certain things I did not want to have to ask for. He called me on Thursday at 4 o'clock. "Evelyn," he said, "Marcus filed this afternoon. Fault-based complaint. Adultery and financial misconduct." I said, "Adultery?" Harold said, "Brooke, it seems, had been seeing her yoga instructor for some months. The private investigator Marcus hired last week, on his own initiative and without consulting me, turned up enough to file without Brooke's cooperation. He also included her forgery of Marcus's signature on a credit application in June for a line of credit that I gather was intended to, shall we say, smooth the transition between Marcus's income and whatever came next." I was silent a moment. I said, "She was planning to leave him too," Harold said. "She was planning to leave him the moment your house was hers." "Yes." I said, "Harold." He said, "Yes." I said, "Do we tell Marcus we know?" Harold said, "I do not believe we need to. He knows. He has known longer than he wanted to admit. I think he hired the investigator 3 weeks before you came home, Evelyn. I think he has been, in his own small and cowardly way, building a record of his own." I thought about this. I thought about my son, who had watched his wife renovate his mother's kitchen, who had sat at my dining room table while she dismissed me, who had signed off on an assisted living brochure without consulting me, and who had also quietly, while doing all of this, hired a private investigator on his wife because he had suspected her of the other things she was doing. My son had been capable, all along, of suspicion. He had simply applied his suspicion in the wrong direction. I said to Harold, "All right. I will see him on Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Let him tell me himself." Harold said, "Evelyn, one other thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "Brooke has retained an attorney from a firm in Rittenhouse Square. The attorney is Sterling Grayson. Do you know him?" I said, "Harold, I argued 3 cases against Sterling Grayson in the 90s. He is competent and he is expensive and he is not a problem." Harold said, "I didn't think he was. I wanted you to know." I said, "Has he reached out?" Harold said, "He reached out to me this morning. He suggested that Mrs. Hartwell, meaning Brooke, would be willing to, and I quote, set aside the difficulties of the past several weeks, in exchange for a modest settlement of $200,000 and a mutual non-disclosure agreement." I laughed. I actually laughed. I said, "Harold, what did you say?" Harold said, "I told Mr. Grayson that Mrs. Hartwell, meaning you, did not have difficulties of the past several weeks to set aside. I told him that Mrs. Hartwell had a record of 18 months, a set of audio recordings from the kitchen that I had not yet mentioned to anyone outside the firm, and a grandson who was prepared to testify about specific conversations his stepmother had conducted with him about his deceased mother. I told him that Mrs. Hartwell was also the plaintiff, should she choose to become one, in an elder financial abuse action under Pennsylvania's Older Adults Protective Services Act, which carries, as he knows, both civil and criminal remedies. I told him that Mrs. Hartwell was not interested in a settlement because Mrs. Hartwell had never made a claim. And I told him that if Mrs. Brooke Hartwell attempted to contact Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell, or Mr. Noah Hartwell, or any member of the Hartwell family directly or through any representative other than Mr. Grayson himself, Mrs. Hartwell would file the abuse action the same afternoon, and would request a press embargo on the filing only as a courtesy to her son. I said, "Harold, what did he say?" Harold said, "He was quiet for some time. Then he thanked me for my clarity, and he said he would counsel his client accordingly. I do not believe we will hear from Mrs. Brooke Hartwell again." I sat at my kitchen island. I looked out the window at the afternoon light coming down through the bare branches of the dogwoods. I said, "Harold, thank you." He said, "Evelyn, it is the easiest representation I have ever done." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because you were the one who built the case. I just carried the documents." Marcus arrived at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. He came in a taxi because he had been driving Brooke's car for the last year and it had, I gathered, gone with her, and his own car had been sold 18 months ago when they moved in with me because they had only needed one. He stood on my porch in a clean sweater, clean-shaven for the first time in 3 weeks, and when I opened the door I saw that he had been crying on the way over. Not heavy crying. The quiet kind a man does in the back of a taxi when he knows he is about to have the hardest conversation of his life, and he wants to have it with his eyes clear. I said, "Marcus, come in." He came in. I took his coat. I hung it on the hook where Richard's coat used to hang, the hook where Brooke's coat had hung for 18 months, the hook where I had thrown Brooke's remaining coat onto the lawn 3 weeks before. The hook was empty now. It had been empty for 3 weeks. I hung Marcus's coat on it. I said, "Let's sit in the library." He said, "Mom." I said, "What?" He said, "The library is back." I said, "Yes, it is." We walked into the library. Richard's oak desk was in its place. Richard's law school diploma was back on the wall. The Swedish flatbox desk was gone. The photographs Brooke had hung, all of them photographs of her family on vacations Marcus had not taken, had been removed from the walls, and the walls had been repainted the weekend before, back to the deep green they had been for 36 years. The built-in shelves were full again. Richard's books were on them. The small leather armchair Richard had read in every evening for 3 decades was in its corner, and across from it, in the armchair I had read in, I had added a small second lamp, and on the small table between the chairs Noah had placed, the previous Sunday, a photograph of his grandfather that he had found in a box in the attic. Marcus stopped in the doorway. He stood there a long moment. He looked at his father's desk. He looked at the photograph. He said, "Mom, how did you do this?" I said, "Marcus, I lived here. I lived here the whole time. You just stopped seeing me." He sat down in the second armchair. I sat down in Richard's. I did not do this to make a point. I did it because Richard's chair was mine now, and it had been for 20 months, and I had stopped asking myself whether I was allowed to sit in it. He put his face in his hands. For a long moment I let him cry. I did not reach out. I did not say anything. There is a kind of crying a son has to do alone in front of his mother, and you have to let him do it and you have to not rescue him out of it. When he was ready, he lifted his head. He said, "I filed on Thursday." I said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "Marcus, I am going to tell you something now, and I want you to understand that it is going to be true for the rest of our lives. I will always know. The way you make your peace with that is you decide, from now on, to do things that you would not mind me knowing about." He looked at me. He said, "Mom." I said, "Marcus, tell me why you filed." He was quiet a long moment. He was looking at his father's desk. He said, "She was sleeping with her yoga instructor. I have known since August. I hired a private investigator in October, the first week when she started talking about getting you out of the house. I thought I was going to use it as leverage to make her leave me, because I didn't have the courage to do it myself. Mom, I was going to let her do the thing to you so I could use what I had on her to get out of the marriage. I was going to let her have the house." He said this to me. He said this out loud. He said it in his father's library, on his father's desk's chair, to his mother, to my face. It is the most honest sentence my son has ever spoken to me in 43 years. I did not say anything. I let it sit in the air between us. He said, I don't expect you to forgive me. I said, Marcus. He said, Mom. I said, I am not going to forgive you today. You are correct about that. But I am also not going to throw you out today. And I want to tell you why. He waited. I said, I am not going to throw you out because you told me the truth. You did not soften it. You did not frame it. You did not call yourself manipulated or confused. You told me the worst thing about yourself, which is that you were going to let your mother be evicted from her own home by a woman you no longer loved so that you could use her adultery against her in a divorce. That is the truth, Marcus. That is what you did. That is who you were for the last several months. And the only way out of being that person for the rest of your life is to sit in a chair and say it out loud to the person you almost hurt most. You have done that. It is not enough. It is the beginning of enough. He nodded slowly. He said, What do I do now? I said, Marcus, here is what you are going to do. You are going to live at Harold's for another month. Harold has agreed to this. At the end of that month, you are going to rent a small apartment of your own choosing, in a neighborhood you can afford on the salary you are going to earn at whatever job you can find after Ashford Partners, which will not be a senior vice president position. You are not going to accept any money from me. You are not going to ask Harold for any money. If you need to eat ramen for a year, Marcus, you will eat ramen for a year. You will pay your own rent and you will buy your own groceries and you will do your own laundry. You are 43 years old, and you have never done any of these things by yourself for more than a few weeks at a time, and it is time. He said, Mom. I said, I am not finished. Every Wednesday evening from 6 to 7:30, you will come to this house, and you will have dinner with Noah and me. You will pick him up from school on Fridays, and you will take him to dinner at a place he chooses. On Saturdays you will take him to the Franklin Institute or to a bookstore or for a walk in the park or wherever he wants to go, because there is a list of things you promised him over the last 7 years that you never did, and you are going to do every single one of them now, and you are not going to cancel, and you are not going to be late, and you are not going to check your phone. If you do any of those things, Marcus, and I find out and I will find out, you will lose your Saturdays with him and we will start over. Do you understand me? He said, Yes, Mom. I said, and Marcus, here is the last thing. You are never ever going to introduce another woman to your son without me meeting her first. That is a permanent rule. You will not violate it when Noah is 14 or 17 or 22. If you want to date, you may date. If you want to marry someone, you may marry her. But you will not bring her to my door or to his door without me meeting her first in Harold's office with a cup of coffee between us, because I am never going to sit in my kitchen again across from a woman who has made a decision about my grandson without having been examined by me first. Are we clear? He said, Yes, Mom. We are clear. I said, Then Marcus, you may come to dinner on Friday. Noah will want to see you. He has asked after you every day. I have told him you were coming back when you were ready. You are not quite ready yet, but you are ready enough for a Friday dinner, and Noah does not need to wait any longer. My son looked at me. His eyes were Richard's eyes and they were wet. He said, Mom. I said, Yes, Marcus. He said, Thank you. I said, Marcus, do not thank me. Earn it. He stayed for another half an hour. We did not discuss Brooke again. We did not discuss the divorce. We did not discuss Ashford Partners, though I mentioned casually that Harold had received an inquiry from a small firm in Wayne that was looking for someone with Marcus's credentials at a considerable pay cut, and that Marcus should call Harold on Thursday if he was interested. We discussed instead Noah. Marcus told me, haltingly, the things he had begun to notice about his son in the last 3 weeks at Harold's. He had noticed, for instance, that Noah was an extraordinary writer for a 12-year-old, that a story Noah had written for his English class in September and brought to Marcus at Harold's the previous weekend was, and these were Marcus's words, Mom, he writes the way Dad wrote. He writes the way Dad used to write to you from law school, those letters you used to keep in the drawer. Did you ever read his stories? I said, Marcus, I have read every story that boy has written since he was 6 years old. His teachers used to send them home, and I used to keep them, and when your father was dying, I used to read them to him at night because they made him laugh. Marcus's face did something complicated. He said, I didn't know that. I said, I know you didn't, Marcus. That is the whole problem. He nodded. He said, Mom, I want to know him now. I said, then know him. Start on Friday. Show up. Be there. Listen more than you talk. Do not make him tell you what he's been feeling. Make him tell you what he's been reading. Start there. It is easier for a 12-year-old boy to talk about a book than to talk about his life, and eventually the book will lead you to the life. Your father taught me this. He said, Dad taught you that? I said, Marcus, your father was a remarkable man, and you never really knew him, because you spent the last 10 years of his life arranging your visits around your wife's schedule. I am going to spend some portion of the rest of my life telling you about him if you are interested, and I think you should be interested. He said, I am, Mom. I said, then come to dinner on Friday. Noah wants pizza. I have already ordered it. He chose the toppings himself. Marcus almost smiled. For the first time in 3 weeks he almost smiled. He stood up. I walked him to the front door. I handed him his coat. At the door he paused. He said, Mom. I said, yes. He said, the green countertops. The ones Dad gave you in 1993. Are they really coming back? I said, they are being installed the first week of December. Harold found them in Lancaster, a salvage yard. They had been pulled out of a house in Westchester that was being flipped. The new owners didn't want them. Someone didn't know what they had. Marcus nodded. He said, I didn't know what I had either. He looked at me. He said, I'm going to try to know now. I did not hug him. I was not ready. He was not ready. I touched his arm once briefly and I said, Good night, Marcus. He walked out to the taxi at the curb. I closed the door. Noah and I went through the winter quietly. Marcus came to dinner every Friday, and he took Noah to the Franklin Institute on the first Saturday of December, and to an indoor rock climbing gym that Noah had been talking about for 2 years on the second Saturday, and to a bookstore on South Street on the third Saturday, where Noah had picked out a science fiction novel that Marcus, to his credit, had read over the following week so they could discuss it. On the fourth Saturday of December, which was Christmas Eve, Marcus came to the house at 4 o'clock and sat with us at the kitchen island while I made lasagna, and Noah helped me grate the cheese, and Marcus, who had never, to my memory, helped me with any meal at any point in his adult life, washed the mixing bowls in the sink. The three of us ate together in the dining room. I used my mother's china. The china Brooke had called the china we have. The china that was now, as it had always been, mine. In the spring, I hired the contractor who had originally installed the kitchen in 1993, a man named Donald Reich who had been retired for 5 years and who came out of retirement specifically for this job because I had asked him to. Donald reinstalled the green granite countertops. He replaced the white shaker cabinets with the cherry cabinets that had been in the kitchen for 30 years, which Harold had located, astonishingly, at the same salvage yard in Lancaster. He reinstalled the gas range that Brooke had replaced with an induction cooktop. When the kitchen was finished the second week of April, I stood in the doorway and I thought, this is my kitchen again. And I thought Richard would recognize this kitchen. And I thought, Noah is going to eat at this island until he leaves for college, and he is going to remember the countertops, and they will be the same countertops his grandmother had when his grandfather was alive, and the continuity will matter to him in ways he will not be able to articulate until he is much older. Brooke, I heard through various channels, had moved to Arizona. Her yoga instructor had not, in the end, left his own wife, and Brooke had, in the parlance of her former Pilates friends, reinvented herself in Scottsdale, where she had begun a small business selling artisanal candles through a website that bore her maiden name. I did not look at the website. I did not need to. The divorce was finalized in March. Brooke received approximately $11,000 from the sale of a piece of furniture I had not permitted back into the house, and a portion of Marcus's retirement account from Ashford Partners, which amounted to somewhat more. She did not receive any portion of my estate, because she had no legal claim to any portion of my estate, because the Hartwell provision had been watertight for 18 months before she ever attempted to test it. Marcus, for his part, took the job at the small firm in Wayne that Harold had mentioned. He earned considerably less than he had earned at Ashford Partners. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Mount Airy, 1 bedroom for himself and 1 for Noah, because Noah began spending every other weekend there starting in April, at his own request. He bought himself a used Subaru. He learned to cook, badly at first and then with gradually increasing competence, and by the end of the summer, he was capable of producing a credible roast chicken, which he made for Noah and me one Sunday evening in August at his apartment, at a small round table in his small kitchen, and I did not tell him that I had taught him to roast a chicken when he was 16 years old, because some lessons have to be learned twice, and the second lesson does not need to be about the first. Harold retired in June. He had been threatening to do so for 7 years and had never quite managed it. I suspect the case we built together for Richard, the case I had brought him into in the spring of the year before last, had been the case he had been unconsciously waiting for. Something about finishing it, about seeing it all the way through, about watching the documents he had drafted at my kitchen table with Richard shake out exactly as we had planned, had given him a kind of permission to walk away. He had a retirement party at the firm, which Noah and I attended, and he gave a short speech in which he mentioned Richard 3 times and did not mention me once, which I appreciated, because Harold understood that the story of what had happened at 1847, Willowmere Lane, was not a story that belonged in a retirement speech, and that some victories are honored best by not being spoken of. After the party he walked Noah and me to the car. He said, "Evelyn, one more thing." I said, "What is it, Harold?" He said, "The bottom drawer of your nightstand. The little black box." I said, "What about it?" He said, "The notebook is in there, isn't it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Never destroy it." I said, "Harold, I wasn't planning to." He said, "Good. I have seen many cases come and go in 52 years at this firm. I have never seen a case built more carefully or more patiently, or by a more prepared witness than you. The notebook is not just evidence, Evelyn. It is a record of what it takes to survive being underestimated. You might someday want to read it to a great-granddaughter." I looked at him. I said, "Harold, do you think I'm going to have great-grandchildren?" He said, "Evelyn, if Noah grows up into a man half as serious as his grandmother, he is going to have a very large family, and every one of them is going to know this story." I laughed. Noah behind us was pretending not to listen. Harold leaned down and shook my grandson's hand very formally, the way a lawyer shakes the hand of a client he respects. He said, "Noah, it has been my honor." Noah said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." We got in the car and drove home. The summer was a good summer. Noah had friends to our house in the backyard, and he swam at the neighbor's pool 2 streets over, and he grew almost 2 inches between June and August, and his voice began very tentatively to deepen. We went to Vermont in July for 2 weeks, and we stayed with Margaret, and Noah discovered over the course of those 2 weeks that he was a reasonably good fly fisherman, which pleased Margaret enormously, because her late husband had been a fly fisherman and had always wanted a grandson to teach, and had never had one. When we came home, Marcus had, without being asked, spent the weekend repainting the porch, and had left a note on my kitchen island that read, "Mom, hope this is the right color. I checked the old cans in the basement. Love, Marcus." The color was the right color. He had matched it to a paint can Richard had stored in the basement in 2011. He had, without my asking, done the research. I stood on my porch that evening looking at the fresh paint, and I thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. It does not look like grand gestures. It looks like a 43-year-old man matching a paint color because he wants his mother to notice he noticed. In September, Noah started 7th grade. He had a new science teacher. He had a new homeroom. He joined the school's creative writing club, which had 4 other members, all of them girls, which pleased him enormously. He began writing, I should mention, a novel. A science fiction novel about a boy on a space station. He showed me the first chapter in October, on the anniversary of the week it had all come down. I read it at the kitchen island with a cup of tea, while he watched me with the anxiety of every 12-year-old who has ever shown a grandmother a piece of their writing, and when I finished I said, "Noah, this is extremely good." He said, "Really?" I said, "Really. You have your grandfather's ear for dialogue. You have my eye for structure. It is a tremendous combination. Keep going." He said, "Grandma, would you read it as I write it?" I said, "Noah, I will read every single chapter every single week, for as long as you want to keep writing, and I will keep doing it until I die or until you tell me to stop." He said, "Okay." He went upstairs to keep writing. I did not tell this story to anyone outside of my family for a long time. I did not tell it at my book club. I did not tell it to my friends at church. I did not tell it to the women I walked with in the mornings, 3 of whom had been my neighbors for 25 years and who knew only the broad outline, which was that Marcus had moved in, and then moved out, and that Brooke had moved to Arizona, and that Noah had come to live with me. The specifics I kept to myself. I kept the notebook in the bottom drawer of the nightstand. I opened it occasionally on winter nights when the wind was up and Noah was asleep and I was reading in the library in Richard's chair. I read the entries, the small precise handwriting, the dated specifics, the accumulation of ordinary cruelty that I had patiently, over 18 months, made into a record that had saved me in a single morning. I did not read it with satisfaction. I read it the way one reads a diary from a difficult year, which is to say with a certain distance and with a kind of gratitude not for what had been done to me, but for the fact that I had been the kind of woman who had known quietly for 43 years how to write something down. One evening in late October of the following year, which would have been almost exactly 2 years after the morning I had driven home from Vermont, I was sitting in the library when Noah came in. He was 13 by then. He had grown again. He was nearly my height. He sat down in the second armchair, the chair that had become his chair over the course of the year, and he said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart." He said, "What happened that morning? The morning you came home from Aunt Margaret's?" I said, "Noah, you were there." He said, "I know. But I was 12. I saw parts of it. I want to know the whole thing now. I want to know how you did it." I looked at my grandson, at Richard's eyes in his almost 14-year-old face, and I understood that he was old enough to hear it, and that if I did not tell him the whole thing now, someone else would someday tell him a version of it, and the version they told him would not be the true version. I stood up. I walked to the little black box in my nightstand. I brought back the leather notebook. I sat down in Richard's chair, and I opened the notebook to the first page, and I read my grandson the first entry, the one from August 14, 2023, about the bedroom being repainted. I read him the second. I read him the third. I read him, over the course of the next 2 hours, with breaks only to sip my tea and to let him ask questions when he needed to, every entry in the notebook from the first to the last. He did not interrupt. He did not cry. He listened with the serious quiet attention of a child who had been waiting, without knowing he had been waiting, to have the world of his childhood explained to him in his grandmother's own voice. When I finished, when I had read the last entry, the one that said resolution is underway, he sat a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Grandma, did Grandpa know?" I said, "Noah, your grandfather planned most of what I did. He just did not live long enough to do it himself. He taught me how. And then he trusted me to do it when the moment came." Noah said, "Grandma." I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." I said, "Noah, don't thank me." He said, "No, I want to. Thank you for being the one who did it." I looked at him. I said, "Noah, it was my job." He said, "Grandma, it was not your job. It was your choice. I know the difference now. Grandpa asked you to make sure I was all right. He did not tell you how. You figured out how. And you waited 18 months to do it. I know what that took." I did not cry because I had not cried at any point in that story when I was telling it, and I was not going to start now. But I sat in my husband's chair, across from my grandson, with the leather notebook open on my lap, and I allowed myself a long, slow breath. I said, "Noah, I am going to tell you something now that your grandfather told me once in this room on a Sunday afternoon when you were very small. He said, 'The woman you dismiss because she does not demand to be seen may be the one who decides, when the moment comes, whether everything stands or falls.'" He was not talking about me at the time. He was talking about a case he was working on, about a client who had been underestimated by her family. But I have thought about it many times since then. And I want you to remember it, Noah. Not because you are ever going to be in my position,